Welcome back to Conservative American Predictions. Today, I'm going to be doing my final best case scenario for Vice President Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential election. So this is not my official prediction, this is not how I see the race going, just an absolute realistic best case for the vice president. So as you can see, she starts out with 216 electoral votes, Donald Trump with 106. So getting into the likely states, there's quite a few for Donald Trump. We'll start with a couple for him. Those consist of states like Nebraska, the 1st District of Nebraska, the state of Kansas, not Nebraska, South Carolina, Florida, Iowa, and Maine's 2nd, as well as Ohio. So I'll just kind of go and discuss these briefly. So out of Kansas, the state voted for him by a pretty decent margin back in 2020. However, it has been shifting to the left in recent years. As you can see here is about a 14.5-point win out of this state, which is, definitely a left-shifting state. There's a lot of room for Democrats to grow in the suburban areas, and Kansas even has a Democratic governor, so definitely some room to grow here, and I think in a best case it could go as low as probably R+9. Nebraska's first, very similar situation to Kansas, a area where there's a lot of suburban growth potential for Democrats, and I expect it to be a similar margin as 2020 in a normal election, but at a best case for Harris, I think it could drop down to about 9 as well. Iowa is a pretty right-shifting state. There's a lot of, rural and working-class voters in the state. It was a former pretty blue state, somewhat of a bellwether state, and it's morphed into a pretty reliably Republican state, and I believe even in a best case for Kamala Harris, Trump would win it by around 6 to 7 points, doing pretty well here. Out of Ohio, same thing. I think he would win by probably around just over 5 points in a worst-case scenario, as even though Harris does have room to gain in the suburban areas of the state, specifically in the central part of the state, Trump has still enough room to gain in rural and working-class areas in the northern parts of the state that I think it would kind of not cancel the effect out, but it would help minimize the damage that it would do, and it would still give Trump the state by a likely margin. South Carolina, I think, would drop down to about probably 7 or 8 points in a best-case scenario for Kamala Harris. She could do well enough among the affluent white vote in the coastal area of the state while also doing very well with African-American votes in the more central area of the state, which helps drop the margin down several points. And then out of Florida, a state where, you might expect it to be lean in a best case for Kamala Harris, with how early voting is looking, I really don't even see a path to this dropping below 5 points. So in a best case, I'd say it's probably about 6 to 7 points for Donald Trump, as regardless, he is going to be improving here. And then Maine's 2nd District, I think in a worst case scenario, would drop to about 5 or 6 points for Donald Trump. Still a strong margin, but a little bit less than he won by in 2020. And now for some likely states for the vice president. We have quite a few of these, or actually we really don't have quite a few of these. There's a lot that are borderline likely. However, as of now, I'm not going to categorize them as such. But there is one that is Minnesota. This is her VP nominee's home state, Tim Walz. He's the governor here, and I think in a best case scenario, you could see them win it by about 11 points, doing very, very well in the Minnesota or in the Minneapolis suburbs, while also maybe in a best case scenario, Walz could help a little bit in rural areas. And this would bring the state up to about an 11-point margin. So now we come down to some of the more interesting states, and we'll start with some of the higher margined ones first, and we'll do a bit of a deeper dive into some of these, like Alaska. So in a best case scenario for Kamala Harris, I think Alaska is going to be probably about 4 points. So it voted for Trump by 10.1%, and there were some areas of the state that actually, interestingly enough, shifted to the right, even though the state overall shifted to the left, specifically in heavily Native American areas in the northern and western parts of the state. And I think you're going to see this trend continue this year, but in a best case, you could see those revert narrowly back to Harris. But where you're going to see her gain the most is in this part of Alaska as well as in Anchorage, which, as you can see, took a pretty sharp shift to the left from 2016 to 2020. And I expect that trend to continue, even in a normal year, and in a best case for Harris, though, to really narrow the margin down. And then after this, I suppose the state of... We'll go to some lean states for Harris next, as there's one more for Trump that I believe could potentially be lean, but we're going to hold off on it for now. But starting with the first state for Kamala Harris, if early vote improves enough for the Democrats here, I think that she could win it by a pretty decent lean margin, probably around 4 or so percent in a best case. As you can see here, Biden won it by 2.4. And if Harris would do well enough in the early vote, I think she could shift places like Carson City, Story, and Washoe counties to the left, as well as holding her ground in Clark, potentially shifting some of these other more rural counties, and giving the state to her by a pretty sizable margin. The next state I believe she could do the same thing in is Michigan, which Biden won by a sizable margin as well as in 2020 by 2.8%. And it is a right-shifting state as well. However, Kamala does still have some room to gain here, as it is in a super right-shifting state, but Trump does still have a good chance here. But in the best case, Kamala is definitely favored, as she could hold her ground in the Detroit area, improve in the western part of the state, and just overall hold margins in some counties like Eaton, Clinton, Saginaw Bay, and Midland counties. And that would help her, hold the state probably by around 4 to 5%. And then after this, the state of Arizona, I think in a best case for Kamala Harris would be a lean margin in her favor, as this state did vote for Joe Biden by 0.3%, and right now I have it going to Donald Trump by a tilt margin. So in a best case for Harris, I think it could be won by anywhere between 2 and 3%, with Harris improving strongly in Maricopa County, while still probably decreasing her margins in Yuma, Pima, Santa Cruz, and Cochise, but again, improving in Maricopa and probably a little bit in Pinal, which helps her overall shift the state in her favor. And then after this, we will go to the state of Texas, which at this point, I really don't see dropping below a lean margin. Sure, it would be a narrow lean margin of just over a point, probably about 1.5 points, but there isn't a pathway to it dropping below that 1.5 point margin, or much less flip. So as you can see here, Trump is probably still going to gain in the heavily Latino southern and western parts of the state. As you can see here, he gained there a lot from 2016 to 2020, and that trend is expected to continue. But where, Harris is going to be able to make up that margin is in heavily suburban areas outside of Dallas County, in places like Collin, Denton, and Tarrant counties, even in the ex-urban areas around Dallas. She can also make up ground in Travis, Williamson, and Hayes County, again, as well as their ex-urban areas, and that's going to help her shift the margin down a lot in Texas, and that would bring it down to 1.5%. But again, I really don't see a pathway forward from that point for a victory for her or even a tilt margin. And then after this, we'll go to the state of Pennsylvania next, to which I have going for Donald Trump by a tilt margin as well right now. And I think in a best case, you could see it shift about 4 points in Kamala Harris's favor, and this would be because mainly of urban and suburban trends. I think you could see Harris improve in Allegheny, in Harrisburg, Dauphin County, potentially Cumberland County, and improve significantly in Philadelphia, Delaware, Chester, and Montgomery in a best case scenario. So even if Trump is gaining in some of these rural areas, some of these working class areas, it wouldn't be enough to counter the shift, and it would give Kamala Harris the win by about 3.5 percentage points. Also, Bucks would probably take a shift towards Kamala Harris in this scenario. And then the next state for Kamala Harris is the state of Wisconsin, which is going to vote for Trump by a pretty sizable tilt margin right now, in my opinion. However, in a best case for Kamala Harris, I think she could win it by up to about 2.5 to 3%. I do have Trump doing very well on the western side of the state and overall just the entirety of the state, except for kind of the southeastern corner of the state, excluding Kenosha and Racine. But in a best case for Harris, she could improve a lot in this area of the state again: Ozaukee, Washington, Waukesha, Milwaukee, and then the Brown, and this is the Green Bay area. I think she could improve here, maybe a little bit in Door County in a best case. And then she would still go down in some of the western counties and the rural counties, but I think she could hold her margin at Dane, maybe even improve a little bit, improve in some of these surrounding counties around Dane, and overall just do really well in the southern part of the state, which would help her increase her margin, or at least increase Biden's margin, and bring it up to a medium-sized lean margin. And it would come down to two final states. Georgia, I believe in a best case for Kamala Harris, is lean in her direction. I do have it going for Trump by about 1.5 to 2 points right now, so I believe in a best case for Kamala Harris, she could win it by about 2 points. I think that where that victory would come from is mainly the Atlanta area, not only in her gaining in Atlanta itself in places like DeKalb and Fulton counties as well as Clayton counties, but in places in, again, not only the suburbs, the suburban counties surrounding Atlanta, which you've seen take a large shift towards Democrats in recent years, but also the ex-urban areas around Atlanta. I mean, these counties have been taking a large shift too, places like Cherokee and Forsyth. Counties shifting toward the Democrats. That would be a huge net gain for Harris. And even if Trump is gaining in rural areas like in the central eastern parts of the state and the 2nd District in the Southwest, it would not be enough to counter these movements in the Atlanta area, and that would help give Kamala Harris the state by about 2 points. And then the last state is the state of North Carolina, which I believe in a best case for Kamala Harris would go to her by a tilt margin by about 0.75%. So I think that in a best case, you would see Harris improve a lot in this kind of central part of the state. Counties like Forsyth, Guilford, Almanace, Orange, Durham, Wake, and other surrounding counties she could improve in. She could also do a little bit better in some of these kind of suburban swing counties like Nash and Wilson. And Trump would probably still gain a little bit in the northern part of the state, which he did actually gain in from 2016 to 2020. But Harris's improvements in these areas and here would prevent Trump from winning the state, as well as her improving in places like Mecklenburg and its surrounding counties and potentially even Macomb County. This would help give Kamala Harris the state and bring her up to a nice size electoral college victory, 319 to 219. And you might argue that, in some absolute best case for Harris, she could win Texas. And while that might be true, I really don't see a pathway to victory for Kamala Harris any higher than 319 electoral votes. So I hope you did enjoy this video. Once again, this is not my actual prediction for 2024, just a final best case scenario for Kamala Harris. Stay tuned for the best case scenario for Donald Trump. But again, I hope you did enjoy this video, and I'll see you guys next time.